If you watch this channel regularly, please subscribe for more heart health videos. I'm Jessica Morgan, and on this channel, my mission is to give you the science and practical tools to not only live longer, but to feel better. And as always, even though I'm not your physician, so please talk to your doctor before making any changes to your health regimen, because this video is educational only and not medical advice. So let's get into it. Why the early morning is the most dangerous hour for your heart. There's a pattern in cardiology that most patients never hear about, but I see it over and over again in the emergency department data, and it has shaped how I counsel the older adults in my clinic. The pattern is this: heart attacks, sudden cardiac death, and strokes are not evenly distributed across the day. They cluster, and they cluster in the morning. So when researchers pulled together the numbers from multiple large population studies across more than 2 decades, the finding was remarkably consistent. Between roughly 6 a.m. and noon, the risk of a heart attack climbs by about 40%. The risk of cardiac death jumps around 29%, and the risk of stroke increases by close to 49%. So those are not small numbers. Those are big spikes happening in just a 6-hour window, every single day, in millions of people. And once you understand that pattern, then the next logical question is, why? What is actually happening inside your body during those early hours that makes the cardiovascular system so much more vulnerable? And the answer is layered, because your body doesn't just wake up once. There is an entire sequence of hormonal, vascular, and nervous system events that start well before your alarm clock goes off and continue unfolding for hours after you open your eyes. The cascade your body runs through between 2 a.m. and noon. The first thing to understand is that your body actually starts preparing to wake up long before you consciously do. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, your brain begins ramping up cortisol production. So cortisol is often called the stress hormone, and for good reason. It does a lot of useful things during the day, like regulating your metabolism and helping you respond to challenges. But during the early morning hours, that rising cortisol is essentially switching your body from a recovery mode into a get-ready-to-perform mode. And as cortisol climbs, your blood sugar goes up a little, your blood vessels start to constrict, and your heart rate picks up. And all of those things are normal, but they all also raise the workload on your heart. So on top of that cortisol story, your platelets, those are the little cell fragments in your blood that help you form clots, they also become more reactive in the morning. The work from Toffler and colleagues back in the late 1980s first showed this, and it has been replicated many times since. So your blood is literally more sticky during the early hours, which is one of the main reasons a clot that might be harmless at 2 in the afternoon becomes dangerous at 8 in the morning. And then comes the part most people are completely unaware of. Your blood pressure doesn't just rise in the morning, it surges. So the average morning surge in systolic blood pressure is somewhere around 23 millimeters of mercury, and the diastolic surge is about 15. And the bigger that surge is, the more dangerous it is. In fact, every additional 10 millimeters of mercury in that early morning surge is associated with about a 22% higher risk of stroke. That's per 10 millimeters. So if your surge is 30 to 40 points, you're stacking risk on top of risk. So when you put the cortisol piece, the platelet piece, the blood pressure piece, and the sympathetic nervous system activation all together, your cardiovascular system in the early morning is essentially a primed and loaded system. And then you add behavior on top of that, and that is where things can really go wrong. The one thing most older adults do within 30 seconds of waking. So here's the moment I want to focus on, because I think this is the most underappreciated piece of the entire morning cardiovascular story, and it's something almost everyone does without thinking about it. The moment your alarm goes off, what's your very first move? For most of the adults I talk to, and honestly, this used to be true for me too, the answer is you swing your legs over the side of the bed, plant your feet on the floor, stand up, and immediately start moving. Maybe you walk to the bathroom. Maybe you head to the kitchen. Maybe you start shuffling around the house. And all of that happens within about 30 seconds of consciousness. And it feels completely innocent. It's not like you're doing anything extreme. You're just, getting out of bed. But what is actually happening inside your body during that 30-second window is, well, it's not innocent at all. So when you spend the night lying flat, your blood volume redistributes. Blood pools in your legs and your abdomen. And your sympathetic nervous system, which has been dialed down for sleep, is just starting to ramp up. Your blood pressure is already beginning its morning climb, and your heart is already working harder than it was 2 hours ago. And then you stand up, suddenly. So your body has to do something extremely difficult in those few seconds. It has to rapidly recruit blood back up from your legs, constrict blood vessels, increase your heart rate, and stabilize your blood pressure to keep blood flowing to your brain. And that whole sequence is called an orthostatic challenge. And for younger, healthy people, the cardiovascular system handles it smoothly and you never feel a thing. But for an older adult, especially one who already has stiffened arteries, some degree of underlying heart disease, or is on blood pressure medications, that same 30-second transition can become a real stressor. And the data we have on this is consistent. Abrupt standing in this early morning window is one of the most reliable triggers for orthostatic hypotension, dizziness, syncope, and in some cases, acute cardiovascular events. So when I say the 30-second morning mistake, what I'm really pointing at is this transition, the abrupt, unthinking, immediate jump from horizontal sleep to fully upright activity. And you're doing it on top of an already primed cardiovascular system that's surging blood pressure, surging cortisol, and surging platelet activity. Why the timing makes the jump out of bed especially dangerous. So I want to be careful not to oversimplify here, because what we're really looking at is the interaction between two separate phenomena, and both of them matter. The first phenomenon is the morning cardiovascular vulnerability, which I just walked through. Your blood pressure is climbing, your platelets are stickier, your cortisol is high, and your sympathetic nervous system is activated. So the entire system is sensitive. The second phenomenon is the orthostatic challenge. When you go from lying down to standing up, the force of gravity pulls roughly 500 to 800 milliliters of blood into your legs and your lower abdomen. Now, your body compensates by squeezing the blood vessels in your legs, raising your heart rate, and tightening things up in the chest. And that compensation usually works fine. But here's the problem. The compensation works best when your nervous system has had time to wake up gradually. And it works worst when you are trying to do it on top of an already activated sympathetic system and a sudden demand. So in the early morning, your system is already racing, and then you ask it to do something difficult at the same time. So it's like flooring the gas pedal while simultaneously yanking the steering wheel. And for some people, especially the older adults I take care of, that combined demand can be enough to push them over the edge. The dizziness you feel when you stand up too quickly, that lightheadedness, the darkening vision, that is your brain telling you it didn't get enough blood flow. And most people shake it off and move on. But in someone with vulnerable coronary arteries or carotid disease, that brief moment of inadequate perfusion can be the trigger that breaks a plaque loose or tips the electrical system into an arrhythmia. And this is exactly the kind of scenario that the 30-second mistake framing is meant to make visible. Because the mistake isn't complicated. The mistake is the speed. Other morning habits that quietly stack onto the same risk. So, getting out of bed too fast isn't the only thing that compounds this morning vulnerability. I want to walk through a few of the others because they often go together, and the cumulative effect can be much worse than any single one. The first is the alarm itself. So, if you use a jarring, sudden alarm, the kind that jolts you awake, that triggers a sharp sympathetic spike before your body has even opened its eyes. So you go from deep sleep to full fight or flight in about 2 seconds. And that alone can raise your blood pressure and heart rate by 20 to 30 points within that first minute. The second is the cold shock on your face. So jumping straight into a cold shower or splashing ice-cold water on your face does something called the cold shock response, which is mediated by the mammalian dive reflex and sympathetic activation. And that triggers a sudden, sharp rise in both heart rate and blood pressure. So the moment you put cold water on your face, your vessels constrict, your heart rate spikes. And in someone with underlying cardiovascular disease, that cold shock can occasionally be the final straw that triggers an event. The third is sudden physical activity on a cold body. So a lot of people like to jump straight into their morning exercise routine without any warm-up. The work by Willick and colleagues in the early 1990s showed that heavy physical exertion in the first hour after waking is associated with a meaningfully elevated risk of triggering a heart attack. The mechanism is similar, unconditioned vessels being asked to deliver high flow at the same time that the morning surge is already in motion. The fourth is straining in the bathroom. So this is the one nobody wants to talk about. But if you have a history of cardiovascular disease, the Valsalva maneuver during a difficult bowel movement can spike your blood pressure sharply, and this can occasionally trigger arrhythmias or even aortic events in susceptible individuals. And the fifth is the morning coffee on a fasting stomach. So if you drink a large cup of coffee first thing in the morning, especially before eating, you get a sharp sympathetic boost, a brief rise in blood pressure, and sometimes a spike in cortisol. None of those are catastrophic on their own, but layered onto the other things I just mentioned, they push the morning baseline further up. What I have my older patients do instead, okay, so all of that is the bad news. Now let's get into the practical side, because there is genuinely a lot you can do, and none of this requires prescriptions or fancy equipment. When I sit down with my patients and we talk about their morning routine, I usually walk them through something I just call the 30 to 60 transition. And the logic is simple. If your body is already working through a 90-minute cascade of hormones and vascular changes, then the worst thing you can do is force it to do everything in 30 seconds. So here's how the framework works in practice. First, your alarm and your first minute. So ideally, you use a sunrise alarm or a soft, gradual alarm rather than a jarring one. But if you're using a normal phone alarm, the move is to keep the phone at the bedside and just open your eyes. Don't sit up yet. Just lie there for what feels like 5 breaths. Let the visual cortex come online. Let the body know that consciousness is starting. There's actually data showing that this brief pause reduces the morning cortisol pulse slightly. Second, the seated pause. So after that first minute of breathing, you sit up slowly, you sit on the edge of the bed with your feet still on the floor, and you just sit there for about 30 to 60 seconds. And during that time, your body is doing the orthostatic adjustment in a controlled way. And you can sip a glass of water during this transition because most adults are mildly dehydrated in the morning, and a small amount of water actually helps blood volume stabilize. So this is one moment where simple hydration does cardiovascular work. Third, the first few steps. So when you get up and start walking, walk slowly for the first minute or two. Don't lunge straight into a full activity. This isn't about being sedentary, it's about allowing that vascular system to fully recruit, let heart rate climb gradually, and let the muscles of the legs engage as a second pump. Fourth, the warm shower, not the cold one. I know cold plunges and cold showers are popular right now, and I get the appeal. But if you're an older adult with any cardiovascular history, the morning cold shock carries real risk. So in my clinic, I usually recommend warm water in the morning, at least most days. And if you really want a cold exposure, do it during the afternoon when the morning vascular surge has subsided and your body has had hours to equilibrate. Fifth, swallow and brush before coffee. So don't start the day with caffeine on an empty stomach. Eat something first. Even a few bites of food blunt the sympathetic spike from coffee, and they also engage digestion and gentle parasympathetic activation, which is the opposite of what fight or flight does, where high blood pressure fits into this whole picture. So I want to come back to high blood pressure for a moment, because the morning is where blood pressure does most of its damage, and it's also where medication timing matters more than people realize. If you are on blood pressure medication and you take your pills only at night, that may not be ideal for some people. The Hope Asia consensus and several morning surge studies suggest that medications with longer morning coverage can sometimes better blunt the early morning surge. But this is very individualized, so please don't change your medication timing without talking to your doctor. What I do want you to bring up with your doctor is the concept of morning hypertension. So if your nighttime readings are perfect, but your morning readings are consistently elevated above 135 or 140 over 85, that morning-only pattern is itself a cardiovascular risk factor. And there are specific strategies for managing it that your physician can walk through. And this is important because a lot of the acute events in the morning are happening in people whose daytime numbers look fine. So if you're not checking your morning blood pressure, you might think everything is stable, when in fact, your morning surge is doing damage every single day. What to do if you feel off in that first hour? So let's say you are doing everything right, and you still feel, weird in that first hour. Lightheaded, a little chest awareness, sweaty, fatigue that's more than just sleep inertia. The first thing is, listen to it. The early warning signs of a real cardiovascular event often feel vague and easy to dismiss, especially in women where the symptoms can be subtle, like jaw discomfort, upper back aching, unusual fatigue, shortness of breath doing very little. None of that is normal just because it's morning. If anything feels off, sit down. Take slow breaths. And if any of those symptoms are new, sharp, or persistent, please don't drive yourself anywhere. Call someone. And if the symptoms are severe or worsening, that's an emergency call situation. I bring this up because I think there's a kind of stoicism in our culture, especially among older adults, that says, "Oh, I just need my coffee. I'll be fine." And sometimes that stoicism is dangerous. So please, take those early signals seriously. The lifestyle pieces that meaningfully change the morning baseline. So, beyond the 30-second transition itself, there are a few long-term habits that genuinely change how your cardiovascular system handles the morning surge. Number 1 is consistent sleep. Irregular sleep schedules disrupt your circadian rhythm and make the morning cortisol pulse more erratic. So, going to bed at roughly the same time every night, including weekends, smooths out that whole hormonal cascade. Number 2 is low overnight sodium and adequate potassium. So, if your diet is consistently high in sodium, your morning surge tends to be bigger. And the more whole foods, fruits, and vegetables you eat, the better your potassium-sodium balance and the calmer that morning rise becomes. Number 3 is movement spread across the day. So sedentary people tend to have stiffer vessels, and stiffer vessels create a bigger morning surge. So daily walking, cycling, or even light resistance work, all of it, helps loosen things up and reduce the abruptness of that surge. Number 4 is reducing evening alcohol. So alcohol disrupts sleep architecture. It fragments your sleep cycles. And unhealthy sleep fragmentation amplifies the morning sympathetic pulse. And number 5, quitting smoking. So this one is the biggest lever, by far, that any smoker has. And smoking in the morning is especially damaging because the nicotine surge on top of the natural morning hemodynamic surge is more than double stacked. The mistake I see most often, and the one I want you to break. So if I had to distill this entire video down into a single change I want you to make this week, it would be this. The 30-second jump out of bed is not a neutral act. It's a cardiovascular stressor happening on top of an already stressed system. And replacing it with a 60-second seated transition is one of the easiest, free, under-radar interventions I can think of. So when your alarm goes off tomorrow morning, try this. Open your eyes, breathe for about 30 seconds. Sit up slowly. Sit on the edge of the bed for another 30 seconds. Sip some water if you have it there. Then stand and start your day at a human pace, not at a sprint. That single, tiny habit will probably not make headlines. Why would it? It's not a drug, it's not a device, it's not a 5-step protocol you have to memorize. It's just patience. But in my clinical experience, it is one of those small changes that pays off in ways that are real, even if they're invisible. And I say this because I have watched older adults, sometimes for years, stack morning stressors on top of each other. Coffee on an empty stomach, cold shower, sudden dash out the door, heavy exercise with no warm-up, all on top of an already surging cardiovascular system. And when something eventually goes wrong, they are surprised. But the surprise is only because the buildup was invisible. The buildup doesn't have to be invisible. And once you see the 30-second window for what it is, you have a chance to change it. The single biggest difference I've seen in my older patients. So let me close by saying this. The difference between the older adults in my practice who handle the morning well and the ones who don't almost never comes down to luck. It comes down to the rhythm they bring to that first hour. The ones who do well treat the morning like a runway, not a thunderclap. They let the lights come on slowly. They let the body come online gradually. They don't ask it to do everything at once. And over time, that rhythm shows up in calmer morning blood pressures, fewer dizzy spells, better energy by mid-morning, and fewer of those pre-7 a.m. calls that I used to dread from patients. The ones who struggle treat the morning like an emergency, and every day their cardiovascular system is responding to it like one. So please, give yourself the runway. A few frequently asked questions I get about this. I want to wrap up with a quick Q&A because these are the questions I hear most often in clinic when I bring up this topic. First question, do I really need to sit on the edge of the bed for 30 to 60 seconds? If I'm healthy, isn't this overkill? So no, it's not overkill. And even healthy younger adults can occasionally feel that head rush when they stand up too fast. But the protocol becomes more important with age, more important with higher baseline blood pressure, and more important with any history of cardiovascular events. So even if you don't strictly need it, it doesn't cost you anything. Second question, is cold exposure ever safe in the morning? So yes, for many low-risk adults, brief cold exposure is probably fine. But for anyone over 60 with a history of blood pressure issues, heart disease, or arrhythmias, I would be cautious. And if you want to do it later in the day, after food, never on an empty stomach. Third question, I've been jumping out of bed every morning for 50 years. Is it too late to change? So no, absolutely not. The cardiovascular system responds to new habits within weeks. Vessel compliance improves with movement. Cortisol rhythm normalizes with better sleep architecture. So it's never too late to shift the trajectory. Fourth question, what about the morning walk? Is that actually safer than the morning gym? So generally, a low-intensity walk is safer than an all-out gym session in the first hour. And the data on this consistently suggests that very vigorous morning exertion in untrained adults carries more risk than equivalent exertion later in the day. And the fifth question, what about morning sex? So this is one I get asked about more than you'd think. And the honest answer is that for most healthy adults, this is fine. The cardiovascular benefits of regular intimate activity outweigh the small acute risk. And the sympathetic activation is similar to moderate exercise. So if you can climb a flight of stairs without chest discomfort, you're probably fine. Pulling it all together. So here's the whole picture in one frame. Your cardiovascular system is biologically primed and very vulnerable in the early morning hours. Your blood pressure is surging. Your platelets are stickier. Your cortisol is rising. Your sympathetic nervous system is already activated. And you, like most adults, are taking that vulnerable, primed system and asking it to do something difficult within 30 seconds of consciousness. So the fix isn't dramatic. It isn't a medication or a supplement or a wearable. It's what you do in those first 60 seconds after your eyes open. It's whether you let your body recruit slowly. It's whether you hydrate, breathe, and start your day like a runway, not a thunderclap. And in my clinical experience, that single change is one of the most powerful, least prescribed, and least appreciated interventions I can give to an older adult who wants to protect their heart. Because the riskiest minute of your day isn't the gym, isn't the highway, isn't the stressful meeting. It's the minute right after you wake up. And once you see it, you can change it. I hope this was helpful. Stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.